If you're joining, please put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat box. And we'll just wait for everyone to filter in. Hi, everyone. If you're joining this event, please put your name where you're joining us from in the chat box. It's really great to have you. Thanks for joining. We're also live on YouTube. So hi if you're watching us from YouTube. Hi, Naya. Thanks for coming. Hi, Jeanette. Thanks for joining as well. Yeah, so if you're just joining us now, please put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat box and say hi. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for more people to filter in. Hi, Rachel. I'm also from Croydon. Hi. Thank you to everyone who's joining. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining now, please put your name and where you're joining us from the chat box. Hi, Millie. Hi, Shyama. So we're just going to wait a few more minutes for some more attendees to join. So you could also maybe put what you're looking forward to about the event. Yeah. So we're just going to wait a few more minutes for some more people to join. So we're going to get started in about 1 minute. So yeah, if you haven't already, please put your name where you're from in the chat box. Hi, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Tanita. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm joining from Croydon today. I'm a member of the Young Emerging Leaders Collective, and I'm a researcher in economics. And I created this event because I think political education is so important because we need to be able to understand the world in order to change it. Today, I'm really grateful to be joined by 3 brilliant speakers. So first of all, we have Noni. Noni is the co-founder of Decolonizing Economics and an educator, creative, and new economics organizer. So Noni, do you want to say hi and tell us where you're joining from?
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm joining from London.
Thank you. So we also have Amy, who is the co-editor of the New Internationalist magazine, which publishes stories on environmental and social justice, and it's a cooperative. She's also part of the Bunker Housing Cooperative in Brighton and Hove and a member of Shoal. So Amy, if you want to say hi.
Hi, yeah, really looking forward to this. And I'm in Brighton, down on the south coast.
Awesome, thank you. And we also have Harpreet, who is an organizer with Tipping Point UK, a human rights lawyer, researcher, and a writer, as well as a PhD candidate at the University of Warwick. So Harpreet, if you want to say hi.
Hi, I'm Harpreet. I'm sitting in Oxford, but originally from London.
Thank you. Okay, so as more people are coming in, if you want to just put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat box as well. If you lose connection, you can always click back on the same link. Also, we have closed captions available. So please click on that. There should be a little button at the bottom that you can use. Also, please continue to use the chat box throughout. And remember, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box, which is a separate one. Just to quickly say that we want this to be as safe and inclusive a space as possible. So please be mindful and respectful of everyone's identities, pronouns, and lived experiences. Okay. So we're going to start with a quick introduction, and then we're going to go on to some analysis, imagination, and action. And then finally, we'll have some questions that you guys can ask our speakers. So first of all, what is economics? So a lot of people think economics is just about money or maths, but it's so much more than that. It's a social and a political science, and it looks at the way society is organized to meet their material needs and wants, to provide for the survival, reproduction, and flourishing of life, and to manage their resources. So we all make economic decisions or decisions that are affected by economics all the time, every day. So that can include for individuals, how you get food, how you get clothed, how you look after your children, and the work you decide to do. And then there's decisions that are also made for us, for example, by the government. So that would be who has access to healthcare, who can live where, and who can work where. So what is liberation? So liberation is about more than just freedoms for individuals or certain groups. It's about everyone having freedom and full collective access to our humanity. And it's something that comes about when we resist the oppressive structures that currently define our reality, and we've abolished them, we've moved past them, and that would be the state of liberation. And this is a quote from Charlene Caruthers about what liberation actually is. So as you can see, it's about creating and maintaining right relationships between people and with the land we inhabit. So it's people and planet centered. So to begin, we're going to go into some analysis. We're going to use economics to analyze what exactly is our current economic reality and why do we need to use economics to be aware of it. So according to the Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, we live in an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And that's quite a mouthful, but it's a really great way to understand the systems that we live under and what we're facing at the moment. So to break that down, it means we're facing an array of different crises at this point in our time. All of these, as well as COVID as well, these are ongoing crises, and they currently define the world we live in. And one of the questions we really have to ask ourselves is, why is it that we have these problems? So what are the systems that define our reality, and what are the systems that have given rise to all of these other crises that are related? And two of the most important systems for us to understand are capitalism and neocolonialism. So what is capitalism? So it's essentially a socio-economic system that's based on profit, and it's one where the means of production are privately owned. So they're owned by the capitalists or the capitalist class, and it's also characterized by the exploitation of the labor force. So the workers, that's us, the masses, we have to work in order to survive. So under capitalism, the means of survival are not openly accessible, and they're mediated through a system that is at its core genocidal and ecocidal. Because when we look at where capitalism has come from, it's been predicated on the enslavement, subjugation, and colonization of African and other indigenous peoples and lands. So it's really important for us to understand these are the origins of capitalism, and these are the origins of the system that is currently the international capitalist system. And it's also really important to note that because of these origins and because of the way capitalism thrives on inequality and social stratification, it reproduces a lot of other racial and a lot of other hierarchies. So for example, systems like anti-Blackness, disableism, and patriarchy are reinforced and produced by capitalism. So what is neocolonialism? So neocolonialism is essentially the contemporary extension of Western colonialism. And it's where Western states still impose domination on formerly colonized countries. So that's often through their economic systems, their economic policies, and their political policies. And one of the ways that happens, probably one of the clearest ways it happens, is through debt and aid. So that's often tied to a lot of conditions that countries have to uphold and fulfill. And that means that a lot of these countries don't have the freedom to direct their own policies and decide how they want to run their countries, essentially. So we're still in a colonialist world. And neocolonialism is distinct from the other type of colonialism, which also is present in the present day, which is settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is what we're seeing and what we've been seeing in Palestine for the last 73 years. So neocolonialism is distinct but related to that. And it's also a form of imperialism. And according to the Ghanaian revolutionary Kwame Nkrumah, who coined the term neocolonialism, it's the main instrument of imperialism today. And imperialism is essentially a stage of capitalist development where Western hegemony is spread across the world. And it's a process that's very much happening at the expense of the global majority. So with these two concepts explained, we're going to now ask our speakers some questions about how the economy, how capitalism and neocolonialism create and maintain social injustice. So, Noni, first of all, so your work at Decolonizing Economics, you do a lot in terms of using, looking at the colonial histories of the economy to kind of understand where we're coming from with that. So could you tell us a bit more about why decolonizing economics is so important to our analysis of the economy?
Thank you. Also, I love that intro and I was taking notes too. So it was just really helpful and a really great way to start. A quote that we always start our workshops with at Decolonizing Economics is to decolonize is to contextualize, right? And a lot of what we do at Decolonizing Economics is to try and contextualize the symptoms of the system that we live in today and the ways in which it impacts people and the different people that it impacts too, right? And so when we contextualize the economy, we kind of recognize that it was started during colonialism, and colonialism is just, at its basic term, as you mentioned, it's just taking over a plot of land and then therefore kicking out people from that plot of land, taking their resources, taking their bodies as labor. And that also means just profit for just forever, right? Because you don't actually, it's extractive. And when we see that those as the roots of the economic system, and that lots of, even Barclays banks, lots of the banks that we have today and lots of the financial institutions and instruments that we have today were directly developed at that time. And we thought that it was really important to get an understanding of the context of the economic system, because I think a lot of the time when we're trying to call for the system to be different, right? Sometimes when we don't understand the system and that the system was designed in a specific way, we can want it to be different, and that might look like making it look a bit nicer instead of uprooting it. And that's why we started, me and the person that I run Decolonizing Economics with, Guppy Bola, we wanted to create a collective that was looking at the roots of the economic system and rethinking what that could look like. And we always come back to the idea that economy means the management of home, and therefore that's the management of the relationships at home and other, because I think in lots of economic spaces which are very mask and very white, it's economics is numbers and GDP or whatever it is, but actually it's about how we manage the relationships and the resources within the current economy. And we have an economic system that manages the relationships really badly, not even badly, they create systems of inequality which are generational. Whilst some generations were able to accrue tons and tons of wealth over time, some generations were not even allowed to live or to exist. And then we kind of see lots of these things through the prison industrial complex and the ways in which people of color are unevenly impacted by inequality across lots of different sectors of society. So yeah, and that's what we do at Decolonizing Economics through like teaching. We create like workshops that kind of situate the ways in which the economy works in relation to like climate justice, in relation to how like specific bodies have been valued under capitalism, and in thinking about like the ways in which we would have to like radically rethink the relationships we have with each other and with like the natural resources that we exist with as well. And yeah, it's important to contextualize the economy, because if we don't, then how can we change it? So I think that's a brief intro into what we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Noni. Yeah, it's so true, because how can you understand the problem if we don't start from that beginning and with that root? So thank you so much for that. Guys, if you have any questions that you want to ask any of our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end. And feel free to keep talking in the chat. And if you've just joined, feel free to introduce yourself and say where you're joining us from. So Amy, so you're a co-editor at the New Internationalist, and there a lot of your work focuses on environmental and social justice. So could you tell us a bit more about and also you're part of Shoal, which is an anti-capitalist writing collective. So could you tell us a bit more about why having an anti-capitalist stance is so important in social justice struggles?
Thanks, Tanita, and yeah, thanks to Noni as well. I'm also taking notes, and I feel like I'm being schooled. I'm enjoying it. It's great. And so there's a bit of a joke, I guess, among some people that I work with, that pretty much everything we write could just be shortened to "because capitalism," and then that's kind of it, which is a little bit flippant, but it kind of shows that whatever we're writing about, whether it be the climate crisis or hunger or anything like that, that we're never too far away from the impacts of capitalism. And I think that it is kind of hard to make, or impossible to make, transformative change without questioning capitalism and its power. And as you kind of, you mentioned in your definition of capitalism earlier, it's all about privately owned kind of property and businesses, and directed towards making the greatest possible profits. And it breeds competition and inequality. For capitalism to work, there needs to be winners and losers and a hierarchy, and many people are never even going to get a look in. It shapes our whole society, our world politics, our power dynamics. It influences our relationships with each other as individuals and communities, and what we spend our time doing. And it feels almost impossible to escape from it. And I find it really hard just to see how we can achieve many of the things that our social movements are working for without addressing the system that breeds oppression and poverty, and things like racism and classism, and kind of as you both have already kind of explained, are all things that are deeply embedded into capitalism. And it's easy to see how within a system that's focused on private ownership and making profits, that the lives of certain people aren't valued, and how things like pollution just become acceptable. And if success under capitalism is what we're striving for, then thriving communities and ecosystems are not going to be necessarily the outcome. And for me, it's really important to try and keep anti-capitalism at the core when thinking about issues of social justice. But it's kind of sometimes hard. None of us are completely outside of this system, and our movements ourselves, we're easily kind of co-opted into this capitalist thinking, and it kind of feels like a constant battle. But I think, yeah, it's about this true liberation and true freedom, and that's kind of, I guess, something to just try and keep as the end goal. And I also think that capitalism kind of limits our imaginations as to what change is possible. We often kind of just accept that things are how they are, because that's just how it is under capitalism. And while that might be kind of our experiences, when thinking about the future, if we believe that capitalism can be dismantled, then a whole lot more seems possible. And I think, yeah, just finally, I guess one kind of slightly hopeful thing is that so questioning capitalism or being anti-capitalist is often seen as too radical or subversive or unrealistic. But I think that with the pandemic, but also lots of things that are happening around the world, that it's led a lot more people to question it. And there's this international communications firm called Edelman, which studies trust on behalf of businesses and charities in order to protect and promote brand reputation. And they do this annual survey on trust. And last year they spoke to over 33,000 people around the world, which isn't really that much when you think about how many people there are around the world. But it was interesting that over 56% of these people agreed with the statement that capitalism as exists today does more harm than good in the world. And so, I don't know, I think it's like signs like this I try and keep hopeful for. I think that 56% wouldn't have been the case, you know, a few years ago. So yeah, try and stay hopeful.
No, thank you. Definitely. It definitely is important to stay hopeful. Thank you for sharing that, Amy. So Harpreet, you recently wrote a report which was called Towards Reparative Climate Justice from Crisis to Liberations, and it was a really amazing read, and so thank you for that. So I wanted to hear a bit more from you about why how capitalism and neocolonialism kind of affect and structure the climate crisis, and a bit more about that.
Thank you. I wanted to start with a quote that Noni, who I've had the privilege of being on a couple of panels with recently, has often heard me, so forgive me, Noni. But it's a book by somebody called Daniel Vosk-Voynick, and he's written a book called The Memory We Could Be, Overcoming Fear to Create Our Ecological Future. And in it, he talks about the way in which history has found environmental and human impacts in the world and the system that we live in today. He talks about mangroves, grasslands, rainforests, and wetlands being destroyed as colonialists entered lands they saw as empty to make way for quarries, plantations, ranches, roads, and railways. And he writes that ecocide came hand in ethnocide. And it's really this system that views land as something to be exploited rather than inherently necessary and intertwined with our well-being, and people as laborers to exploit value from. You really helpfully kind of gave us a frame at the beginning to understand a lot of these issues. That has led us to experience the injustices that we see today in extreme imbalances in who has access to wealth and who doesn't. And it is a system that's been in place for a very, very long time, and it continues to feed itself. And a lot of the entities and institutions, as Noni said, that were involved in slavery and colonialism are still around today, and the way in which wealth is distributed around the globe today is directly related to that history and the way in which it continues to repeat itself through neocolonial trade and investment regimes. Just to give one example, Lloyd's of London, which is an insurance company that is insuring fossil fuel infrastructure and through indigenous territories in Australia, countries that we call Australia and Canada, also insured slave ships, and so make billions every year. And so this kind of continuation of a system that sees shareholders of these financial institutions have huge amounts of wealth, trillions being held by 22 men, for example, while the majority of people really struggle to survive. And that correlation with poverty is also mapped onto climate change as well. And so while something like 7 to 10% of the wealthiest people in the world contribute to most carbon emissions, over 50% of carbon emissions, a very large proportion of the world, more than 50% of the world, contribute very, very few carbon emissions. And so there's a correlation in terms of who is responsible for the crisis, also having the greatest resources. We can see in California, for example, where there have been huge amounts of wildfires over the past few years. Those that have wealth have insurance, and they have private fire services, have the ability to jump into cars and get luxury hotels while their private fire service protect their properties. And at the same time, you see those that don't have the same resources being displaced, and also you see public fire services being staffed by people that have been imprisoned, disproportionately Black people, for very minor offences. And so a kind of system that repeats and engages in inequity. And we also see this, and I usually show a map of what the world looks like in terms of who is responsible for carbon emissions, disproportionately countries in the global north. And if you saw a map of countries and you bloated them in line with their responsibility for historic carbon emissions, the global north would just up most of the map. And the inverse is true in terms of impacts. And that's not to say that there's something specifically vulnerable of countries in the global south. Leon Seeley-Huggins, who's an academic at the University of Warwick, talks about how these vulnerabilities are socially created. They're created through histories of colonialism, a history which saw huge extraction of wealth from the south to the north. And also repeated through trade and investment relationships. So if you take a country like Mozambique, for example, which has experienced unprecedented floods and storms over the past few years, the storms in particular have been linked to climate change. A professor at the University of Oxford has said that the storms have been much stronger and more regular directly as a result of human responsibility for carbon emissions. And it's also the sixth poorest country in the world. It's highly indebted. Its history is rife with Portuguese and British colonial interests, forced labour, forced crop cultivation, high taxes, low wages. The average person in Mozambique emits something like 20 times fewer CO2 than us in this country. Foreign loans have supported coal and titanium mines, and that's enriched investors and not the local people. You've got loan conditions and debt repayments that see investment in education, housing, social security get smaller and smaller and smaller. And this being imposed by creditors in the north. And there are, lots of different examples of the specific institutions involved in that. Just before the UK said that it would eventually stop funding coal, oil and gas internationally, it also said that it was going to put $1 billion into a gas project off the coast of Mozambique. That's the UK Export Agency. So the UK plays a very active role in making carbon fueled infrastructure more likely to happen in the global north. It's got a historic role in that. And there's a huge correlation between those that have resources to be able to withstand climate change and those that have responsibility for carbon emissions, and those that have the greatest responsibility for carbon emissions are insulated from the impacts in a way that those that are not responsible aren't. I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Harpreet. Yeah, that was really informative and really laid out the issue that we're facing that makes, what is it that makes the climate crisis a racist crisis, and the way it's structured around global inequality. So thank you so much for that. So now what we're going to do is move on to the next section. And for this section, we're going to talk about, so we've talked about an analysis of what the problem is, what the systems we're facing are, and what the problem, why they're an issue. And now what we're going to do is think about what do we want to see? So in an economy, in a world where we've abolished capitalism, where we've got rid of all of these systems, what kind of values, what kind of systems, what kind of structures do we want to have in place? So this is kind of like a collective imagination exercise. So I've sent a link in the group chat, So if everyone can just click on the chat and just type your answer. It's anonymous, so no one's going to see your answer, and it's going to create a word cloud for everyone to look at the end. So just fill out what you want to say, and it can be 2 words, 1 word, a sentence, whatever kind of comes to mind when you think about how you would imagine we'd organize resources and share responsibilities in this future. So while the audience members are filling that out, the link is in the chat. Please, can we hear from Noni about what you imagine in this kind of future and what kind of structures you'd like to see?
I like this question, and I like the imaginative. Yeah, I appreciate imagination, because I feel like the future will be really dependent on that. And one thing that I'm really interested in is like the ways in which, because I feel like with current economic thought, or just any form of practicing economics, it's about studying things which have been, I don't know, things which are like commodifiable, right? And things which are like seen, and things which are like rational, and things which are like, I don't know, just basically things that really underpin a lot of toxic masculinity. And I'm really interested in the way in which like what sits outside of that, which is like women's work, or, you know, the ways in which like disabled activists for a really long time have been organizing outside of a system that doesn't allow them to live, right? Or ways in which people are connecting like things which are in the unseen, or which are more uncommodifiable, right? In order to then that create that economic system. So I think in the future, the creation of the economic system will be like really dependent on like the arts and forms of ways in which people like connect to like nature, and things which are really dependent on our relationships as well, and like those relationships will be not based on like reciprocation. I love that word, but I can't say it. You know what I mean. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, and that then requires us to really rethink about what we value. And I always use this example of how, like, you know, nurses who do the most like hardest care work, right, are actually paid way, way less than people who do work which is not actually necessarily socially produces anything, right? So bankers get paid tons of money for work that doesn't give life to other people, for work that doesn't support those relationships and like the interdependency we have with each other. And so I'm really interested in the future where the work that is invisibilized, which is done by like migrant women, which is done in like hidden spaces, is actually valued differently. And I feel like that would just change the conception of the world massively, right? And I think even just on the small scale, the ideas of like how, you know, if you live at home, there's a man who washes, like, you know, look, I'm already thinking about that, like the ways in which like women like do this like domestic labor and men do this other like labor. What happens if we change that in our own small relationships, and what would that happen on like the grander scheme of things? And yeah, and I think that is a really key part to the economy that we want to build. And also because I feel like there's a lot of the imagination exists already currently in the ways in which people who are rethinking and like creating those innovative structures for rethinking the economy. And those people tend to be in like marginalized communities who have already, so we've been like doing research on like, you know, how when the Windrush generation came here, they set up cooperatives to support them to like be able to exist in a racist state. And like that is a form of like economic innovation that existed years and years ago, but you know, is not given that visibility and that like investment and that like support. And so I think just like really rethinking the ways in which we value like feminized work would allow us to like create that imagination of what the economy could look like. So basically just paying nurses a lot of money and carers as well. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really great. Amy, do you want to share your answer?
Yeah, so thanks for this, because I'm pretty terrible sometimes at thinking this like big stuff. I tend to get bogged down in all the steps that it's going to take to get there, and it just all feels really difficult. So it's really good to have this exercise. And I think it's really important because, like, as Noni said, that's like, this is what's needed for us to change things. So yeah, I guess similarly, like I would imagine a kind of economy that's based on care, where we value activity that cares for people, cares for our communities and the planet above anything that does the opposite, which I don't think is really the case right now. And one where wealth and power are redistributed and everyone is able to have safety and shelter and food and all their basic needs met, as well as time and space for joy and healing. I think so often we're just talking about getting the basic needs met, but actually, you know, it would be nice if everyone could also have that as well, like time and to be able to enjoy themselves, because I feel like some people have more of a kind of access to that than others. And in fact, I think healing would be a massive part of like getting to this point. And that includes kind of some of the intergenerational stuff that many people around the world experience. I think it would be an economy where everyone feels and is treated as if they're equally deserving of love and of being heard. And I always wonder what the world would be like, for example, if everyone had the same level of entitlement as like kind of the average white privately educated male. Like what would happen in the world, I think would be pretty interesting. And I think that it would be a world that doesn't, an economy that doesn't require winners and losers in order to function, where we build collective power over individual power, where dialogue and understanding and participation are built into how things work, and we feel collectively responsible for each other, and where community care and self-care are inseparable, where you don't have to feel like you have to just choose one or the other. And I'm a really big fan of this quote, which I don't actually know who it is from originally, so I'd love it if someone does know, but it often gets like printed on postcards and stickers. Everyone wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes. And to me, like the dishes can be all of this kind of labor that Noni was talking about. Could be anything from washing up at a meeting to picking up litter and extending love and care where it's most difficult to do so, or just like really boring admin work of cooperatives. And I think that a lot of the time, the way we deal with these things is linked to kind of the economic systems that we're living under. So, and I'd like to see an economy where doing the dishes, whatever that might mean, is not just this rubbish job that no one wants to do. It's not just left to women and poor people and people of colour, but it's part and parcel of like revolutionary change and how we make things work. So that's kind of what I'd like to see. So we'll see.
Thank you. Yeah, that was beautiful. That was lovely. And Harpreet, could you share what you'd like to see as well?
Well, I think Amy and Noni sounds pretty brilliant and really consistent with how I would like to imagine the future. I think the only thing that I can really add is that this vision is also the only vision that's consistent with a sustainable future. We actually don't have enough space to emit more CO2 and other greenhouse gases to do anything except take care of ourselves. It's like a planetary on our current economic system saying actually the only way for future generations to live in an habitable planet is if your society, if your politics, if your economy is focused on taking care of the earth and each other, and it cannot handle any alternative to the one that Amy and Noni have already described. And I think the only other aspect that I'd really add to that is that a lot of this knowledge is already held. So we have a food system at the moment that is responsible for about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. It's also one of the most dangerous industries, has some of the most deaths in the supply chain, exploitation, huge number of people working in modern slavery conditions, displacement, land degradation, and the alternatives for agroecological farming methods held, particularly by women, particularly by indigenous communities in the global south, and this knowledge for the alternatives, for cooperatives that build on agroecological organic farming are there. And we also have a way of understanding care and stewardship from alternative of knowing through indigenous values of well-being and stewardship and promoting rest and repair and recovery, moving away from growth and towards kind of flourishing.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. That was lovely to hear all your ideas. I'm just going to have a quick look and see what the audience has said. Oh, this is great. So we've got loads of different answers. So climate justice and economy, it's reciprocal. We have the means to survive. Everyone has access to food. Where race, gender, and class no longer exist, definitely. All the categories that currently separate us and are used to like exploit us as well. The way they're employed by capitalism, definitely. That would be great to see them all gone. A culture of respecting boundaries where everyone feels empowered, everyone feels inspired by each other to express themselves. That's really beautiful. I really like that. And healthy relationships, not exploitative ones between people and nature. Absolutely. I think that's key. That's definitely key. And where the most vulnerable are protected. Definitely. Yeah, I really like this answer. Thank you so much to everyone who participated in that. Yeah, and if you didn't get a chance to, feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat. And we're going to move on to the final section. So we're going to talk a bit, so we've talked about what the problem is, we've talked about the world we now want to see, the world we want to create. So now we're going to talk a bit about the actions that are going to help us bridge those two together and get there. And a lot of those actions are about resisting capitalism and neocolonialism. All the different ways we can do that. And one of the most important things during that time when we're doing this is making sure that we're creating and building strong, sustainable communities. And that's really important because if we want to move towards radical change, we need to make sure we have the capacity and energy to get there. And one of the ways that economics can be used to understand this change and these actions is solidarity economics, which is all about creating a better world, transforming our economic system to one that is people and planet centered. And that's really what we're looking at. And I think two of the things that are most important that come under solidarity economics, which have been touched on already, is the fact that we need to be able to meet our needs and help each other meet our needs. And we can do that through mutual aid and cooperatives. So mutual aid, many of you probably heard of it because it definitely made a big comeback in COVID. Well, not comeback as such, because it's always been a really important practice for a very long time in human history, and especially in Black communities and communities of colour. And it's about meeting our collective needs and coming together to do that, and in the knowledge that the powers that be aren't interested or capable of meeting those needs. And also cooperatives. So these, we're going to hear more about these in a second, but these are essentially jointly owned and democratically run enterprises run for and by their members. And they're again about meeting needs and fulfilling aspirations. And they're both really important part of solidarity economics. So having discussed this, we're going to talk a bit more about the solutions that are available to us right now, especially as people operating on a kind of community level and a grassroots level. So to begin, Noni, you recently wrote not recently, it's a few months ago, but a fantastic article on Gowden. And in it, you did talk about how Black communities have always had a history of resisting capitalism, and especially about solidarity economic movement. So I wondered if you could tell us more about solidarity economics and why it's so important to creating radical change.
Thank you. So I feel like for me, the first time I kind of encountered like solidarity economics was like my grandmother, who had a garden that she shared with people that she taught with, because my grandmother was a primary school teacher, and they used to grow food, and these were all women who had lots of children to take care of, and actually didn't have a lot of, because like also at that time there wasn't enough money to like pay them to like do their work, so then they managed to like sustain the work that they were doing in that school by like selling the vegetables. And I used to just think, oh, my grandmother's just going to the garden or whatever. And then I like came here and I started learning about like solidarity economics, and I kind of realized that a lot of our grandmothers, lots of us have grandmothers who have been doing, just literally trying to live, right? And I think, there's one side which is like trying to live, and then, but then I think in like white economic spaces, it's like economic innovation, right? And like, what are those two different ways of like thinking about that? And so from thinking about that, I just spent like, I think last year, just kind of like chatting to people about their grandmothers and like the types of things that they were doing. And I found out that there were lots of different words of describing like cooperative models, especially in African communities. And for example, like in Zimbabwe, we call it like burial societies, because it's ways in which, because like there's lots of people that die all the time in Zimbabwe because of like how much state sanctioned violence they go through. So lots of those communities don't actually have enough money to bury people, so then a whole village will like raise money, a pot of money, to bury that person. And in other communities it's called like Padna, in other places it's called Susu. And it was just really interesting like doing this research and just finding out that that is something that has always existed. And I think a couple of years ago I went and saw Fire Farm from America, which is like a Black-owned farm, and they were talking about how even in the past, like slaves, formerly enslaved people would actually save like money to free one person, and then they'd save enough money to free that same person, like the next person. And just like, there's so many different words of explaining that, but that's still the same practice of just trying to get some form of autonomy and trying to like get some form of well-being through sharing. So I think that is like one of the really great solutions. And I feel like at the moment that knowledge is not, because it's intergenerational, right? And then lots of our elders, like lots of us don't actually, because of displacement, we don't actually live with our grandparents, right? Some of us live in like cities where we don't have access to older people. And I feel like a real big solution at the moment is to trying to create that bridge between like intergenerational knowledge of ways in which people have resisted. Then I think like younger people especially feel like, because I feel like we've existed in the worst of, like austerity, and, from like paying my sister paid £9,000 for uni, and I paid like, what was it, £27,000 in the space of like 4 years, the difference, right? And I feel like a lot of younger people genuinely feel that this system will always be like this, because it always has been like that. And I feel like a really huge tool at the moment is to facilitate that intergenerational exchange of knowledge. And also I feel like on the other side of that, there's something in which like those people that have wealth, which is like white people who have inherited wealth, should also be thinking about ways in which they could like redistribute that wealth in ways that empower communities and doesn't just like create like systems of like dependency and just extraction that exist already. Because it's one thing for us to also people don't invest in like communities of colors solutions about ways in which they can get some form of like economic autonomy and just that agency. So I feel like there's two bits of work that needs to be done, like just the investment and like the recognition that a lot of these solutions already exist in people of color like communities, and also those with wealth redistributing their wealth to make sure that it's just not the same thing that happens, like when a white guy comes up with an idea and then sets up an NGO and then it's like solved, problem solved. And it's just like, that's not how things will be done in the future. It's like communities need to make those solutions for themselves. That's everything from me.
No, thank you. That was really great. Amy, do you want to tell us some more about cooperatives, what they are, because you've got a lot of experience with cooperative organizing?
Yeah, so cooperatives can kind of do pretty much anything really, like from housing to shops, running taxi firms, cleaning firms, running doctor surgeries. But basically it is a business or an organization that is owned by and operated for the benefit of its members. So that's kind of like the technical definition. But and I think, it's really important to to note, as kind of Noni has explained really well, like this history of working in this way of cooperation and collective action, especially among like marginalized communities. I remember my auntie died recently, and at her funeral, her daughter was talking about how when she was a kid, all of the Caribbean mums on their street in Birmingham would just collectivize their childcare because it was basically the only way they could all go to work. And they were just, constantly sharing and that kind of thing. And I think, yeah, that is kind of something that people have always done to survive. And we've kind of already covered this, but like the current system isn't really working for a lot of people, and cooperatives can be one way that people use to kind of meet some of their needs. There's a cooperative was founded by someone called Franny Lou Hamer in the US in 1969, and it had something like 1,500 families and members. They were poor Black farmers fed up with exploitation by white landowners, mostly white landowners. And she said at the time that the time has come now when we are going to have to get what we need ourselves. And for me, that kind of like sums up kind of what a lot of cooperatives are about. They're normally, formed, as I said, because people have identified a need in their lives or in their communities, and they want to say and control over how that need is addressed. So it could be anything like from affordable housing, so it's the co-op I'm a member of, to independent journalism that they can trust. So I work at a magazine called New Internationalist, which is run as a cooperative, but it's what's known as a multi-stakeholder cooperative. So there are the workers who kind of make the day-to-day decisions and control the business and make decisions collectively. And then there's kind of owners who are mostly who are readers. And there's kind of 3,600 of them across the world. And they kind of hold us to account and keep us from just, abandoning our values and going off-piste. And while I think while we're talking about cooperatives though, and I guess I'm trying not to sound negative because I think cooperatives is amazing. I'm like a massive co-op fan. But while they can meet some of our needs, we still bring with us how we've been conditioned, and also we still largely operate within a capitalist system. So by eliminating hierarchies like bosses and workers and landlords and tenants, it doesn't mean that we escape the hierarchy altogether. In fact, that's pretty difficult. So you will still find problems in cooperatives when it comes to interpersonal relationships, kind of the way cooperatives relate with their wider community and all of those things. There's a really interesting kind of amazing organization in Mississippi in the US called Cooperation Jackson. And I was always struck by something that I heard Callie Akuno from that organization say, which is that co-ops are just a tool. They're not a solution in themselves, and co-ops for co-op's sake are not going to bring about kind of the social change that we're looking for. So I think it's really important to remember that and like not get too carried away. But having said all that, they do change a lot within people's lives. They can I'm part of a housing cooperative where it was basically set up by a couple who were just really sick of private rented accommodation, living in a damp flat with their kids, and they couldn't afford to buy a place. They had no hope of getting social housing. And so they were just chatting to their neighbours one day, and they were like, we're just going to set up a housing cooperative. And that's what they did. And 5 years later, they've moved into their like house that they've built, and with affordable rent. It's really low impact. It's on like council land. It's really amazing. But so yeah, I think that they can be really amazing. And through that whole process, like people have learned so many skills. People feel really empowered to change other things in their lives. They can be really great. And I think, sorry, actually, just going back to just one more thing about cooperatives is that one of the downsides, I guess, which is also one of the positives, is that there isn't a boss or a landlord to blame or to fix things when things go wrong. And it's really a massive challenge in collective decision making, and which is kind of what we all need to be better at, I guess. So but yeah, that can be challenging, and people can find that really hard because we're socialized to be competitive or to kind of have that kind of boss employee relationship. and it can be really hard then to kind of address problems. So I think like trying to work on communication and like all of those things are also really important. But yeah, ultimately I think cooperatives have a lot to offer in helping us bring about change. And I would totally advocate for people finding out more about them and setting them up and getting involved in co-ops. And also, yeah, talking more about that history and documenting kind of some of the cooperatives that are already happening in the UK. I think in the US, there's been such a lot of work done to document kind of Black-led co-ops, for example. And in the UK, I think that's one of my dream projects that I'd really like to do, is to work on that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, there's quite a lot of stuff, but I'm happy to answer questions on like the ins and outs of co-ops. I just didn't want to go into too much detail.
Thank you. No, that was really informative. That was really interesting. Thank you. And Harpreet, so you're an organizer with Tipping Point UK, which is a grassroots movement to tackle the climate crisis. So could you tell us a bit more about using grassroots and local solutions to to create climate justice?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I'll start by saying that when we look back at successful moments in history that changes have occurred, we tend to see three things. Places where people are coming together to take care of each other, take care of people that are kind of on the front line of being hurt by poverty and racism and misogyny and, you know, everything that you articulated in that powerful quote from Bell Hooks. Alternative institutions that help give space for people to feel that they can take power and have their needs met, like through solidarity economy and co-ops. And then the third element, which is where Tipping Point and other campaign groups come in, is through highlighting, through agitation and campaigns and identifying current problems and power structures in the state and in capitalism and other spaces, things that need to shift to restructure where wealth and power currently is. And in part, you know, that's because of some of the things that Amy and Noni have already said. Like, there are some really brilliant co-ops, for example, in all over the world, but at the moment I'm thinking of some in Latin America where these co-ops actually mine goods that we need for our phones and our laptops and our electric cars, etc. But a lot of the workers within these mines talk about feeling like they have to self-exploit in the absence of a boss because of the market, the capitalist market that's driving the price. So if you've got an international market and you're selling to Tesla or whatever, your ability to sustain your business is driven by a structure, by the way in which capitalism currently operates. And that structure really limits what's possible to achieve on its own. So really that third element of identifying the ways in which capitalism and imperialism, patriarchy, etc., operate, and identifying demands that can help lead to a reform that improves people's lives today, but also importantly drives the narrative and a vision for really deeper revolutionary liberation that actually seeks to undo those structures. So a reform that just sits back and says, oh, look, we won this thing, these workers, instead of being subjected to this toxic chemical, which leads to lung cancer, are now exposed to this other toxic chemical, which leads to asthma. So like still earning poverty wages, etc., still upholding a particularly capitalist system isn't enough. But if that campaign is run in a way that shows the way in which brands work and exploit those workers and trains workers to form unions and to agitate for more demands and to maybe restructure into a future cooperative, then it has the possibility to really be transformative. And so what we're trying to do at Tipping Point UK is to work with community groups to identify what are those non-reformist reforms that you can agitate for and demand for. And when you're doing that, how can you raise awareness in your community about the root causes of the crisis and try and build towards a bigger structural change? But it's through winning interim demands that people feel powerful, that gives us the possibility to build towards those systemic transformations that we need, I think. So we're going to do that hopefully through targeting institutions like Lloyd's that I mentioned earlier, that are ensuring fossil fuel pipelines, but also have a history of ensuring slave ships, as I say, and they have this kind of reparations washing, if that's a new thing, campaign where they talk about making reparations and at the same time are ensuring pipelines in the Bahamas and Poland and Australia and Canada. And other institutions, including the UK government, when it talks about being a leader, but at the same time has huge elements of the population within the UK, particularly Black people exposed to air pollution, people living in fuel poverty, really challenging its notion of leadership in a context where it's actually driving some of the most pernicious reliance on fossil fuel infrastructure globally. So how can we run these campaigns that get people excited and feel like they've won something, and creates narratives and frames that raise awareness about the exciting possibilities of creating alternative ways of living and being that are more cooperative and caring.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. So we're just going to answer a few questions really quickly because we've gone slightly over. I'm really sorry about that. So one question is, how can we as individuals, and I'd say just if ever, I don't think it's not directed at anyone specifically, but if any one of the speakers can just answer, how can we as individuals contribute to the liberated future on a day-to-day basis?
I could say something. One of the things I was thinking of just when I saw that question was, I think maybe something that Noni mentioned earlier about which I can't say, but like this thing about expecting something in return all the time. And for me, like on a day-to-day basis, this thing of not like giving to receive, I guess, is like one way to contribute towards that.
Thank you. We're quickly going to go to a question from Susanna, who says that since capitalism is a system we're born into, it's even the less privileged simply accept it and never question it, or feel as though we can't question it. So what suggestions do any of you have in terms of opening people's eyes and understanding we need to meet people where they're at?
I can answer that one. I think at the moment, everything is getting so bad that I feel like everyone can't even avoid it. I feel like if I don't, so maybe that's one answer, but also I feel like this is where I feel like prison abolition or like abolition work comes in, right? In terms of like, yeah, because I feel like lots of people just believe that they deserve to suffer, right? And lots of people genuinely believe that they deserve to have lack because of like the stories that we get told about. But I feel like it's, yeah, undoing. I think it always starts like on an individual level, being like, why do you want to suffer? Like, why must you suffer? And why is that something that you're comfortable? And like sometimes people actually don't want to suffer, but then they want, some people are like, well, I worked for it, so everyone else should. But it's just like, what is this obsession with just breaking our backs and suffering for a system that doesn't care about us? I'm not sure if that's a great answer, but I just think it always starts with the ways in which the person individually, silences their own pain and suffering as a result of like the system.
No, yeah, definitely. Thank you, Noni. And probably a last one really quickly, any suggestions as to how we can involve ourselves in cooperatives?
I guess just well, I mean, one place to start is like the Cooperatives UK have quite an interesting directory where you can just type in where you live and see what co-ops are around. I mean, there's so many different co-ops and they all do different things, and some of them are probably easier to get involved with than others. But I would say if you're interested in setting one up, or you want to find out more, if you find a co-op locally or even not locally, and just get in touch with people and just say, hi, can I have a chat and find out more about what you're doing? Often people should be up for that kind of thing. And if you don't get any luck the first time, then try someone else.
Thank you so much, Amy. So we're going to end it there. I just want to say a big thank you to all of the speakers for joining us today. It's been really great to have you guys, and it's been really great to hear from you. Also want to say thank you to Ubele and to the Young Emerging Leaders Collective for all of your support. Thank you to Nicole, who's been helping us with tech today. And thank you to the audience and everyone who's participated today. Yeah, thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you again at another event soon. Oh, Decolonizing Economics is launching a Black People of Color cooperative learning program in September. Ooh, that'll be free for people to attend. Very exciting. So everyone make sure you take a look at Decolonizing Economics website. Everyone's Twitter handles are at the bottom. Is there anywhere else everyone can reach you, speakers, just before you go? No? Okay. Twitter handles at the bottom, and we'll be sending a follow-up email with everyone's information and about any of the references we made today. So thank you so much to everyone for joining. Thank you.